Good day, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm happy to have you here. We are organizing our second activity of Battle of Narratives, which is supported by the European Union. My name is Andrei Stoicu. I'm the team leader of the EU-funded project Support for Strategic Communication. I will be your host today with my colleagues. Our project actually was initiated in Ukraine before the war, and we started by making a huge analysis of the media environment and social media environment and focus groups and surveys in 6 European countries. One of these countries was Germany. And by the time we finished this research and it was about to be made public, the second part of the project was initiated, which is the support for strategic communication. And just a few days after the war started. So we found ourselves in the middle of a very shifting environment. And we've been supporting the Ukrainian government since the project started in February 2022. We have a great team of Ukrainian and European experts. We are doing capacity building, we are doing trainings, we are doing active projects of communication, videos, presentations, and of course, a lot of it has to do with sharing with European experts like you. So I'm very grateful for you to be here. I won't keep it much longer in this for this introduction. I will just kindly ask you when you make your presentations to make pauses between the sentences, which will be much easier for the translator and for the editing part. And I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm kindly inviting you now, the representative of the Ukrainian government who will be here. I think it's Maria representing the Center of Strategic Communication. They are our partners and our good friends, and we're happy to have you here. Thank you, everyone. Maria.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. And I'm very honored and happy to welcome you all here to this Battle of Narratives. I remember our first meeting, the Battle of Narratives, that topic was in Italy, and I can assure you it was completely and incredibly interesting meeting and very useful for all the participants. So I'm sure that today's meeting will be also a great time for all of us, for all the experts. And I'm really honored to open this Battle of Narratives with such a distinguished group of experts who have come together today to discuss this issue that's really important for all of us. And I would just like to make some short notes, some opening remarks for today's meeting. And as all of you here know, that Russian propaganda, disinformation are still very powerful tools of information warfare that Russia uses to manipulate people all around the world, and the influence of Russian propaganda is still very active in all democratic countries, in particular in Germany, that we will be discussing today. And in Germany, Russian propaganda has long and methodologically built its influence and its ground to spread its lies and manipulate public opinion. And after the full-scale invasion, Germany became a strategic partner of Ukraine, and now we can see that mostly German society supports Ukraine, but in the same time, as in any other country, in Germany, we can observe and really different reaction of society to the Russian aggression. And this reaction has several reasons, I would say. Sometimes German citizens do not understand Ukraine well enough to analyze the situation, but more often they learn information from media that still promote Russian narrative. And as I have already mentioned, Russia has been building its informational presence in Germany for many years. It created a network of partner organizations, opened pro-Russian media, distorted the perception of history, and presenting Germany as its strategic partner. Russia built strong cultural, political, economical ties. And we probably know, and probably some research would show us that before the beginning of full-scale invasion in Ukraine, we could see the specific attitude towards Russia in German society as an exotic country. And now we kind of have to do a lot to destroy this image and to explain to especially German citizens what Russia and who Russia really is. And to create its image, Russia invested considerable resources in the German media space, and in particular to promote the narrative of Russia as a savior from Nazism. And ironically, Russia used and still using Nazi topic in its explaining its horrible invasion in Ukraine. But even after blocking of official channels of Russian propaganda affiliated with the Russian government, a significant presence of Russian information influence still remains in Germany. As the last researches, if I'm not mistaken, conducted by the Center of Monitoring, Analysis and Strategy showed that 19% of Germans agrees with the thesis that Russia was forced to go to the war due to the prolonged provocation by NATO. And it shows us that Russia still has its impact and its presence in Russian informational space. And as we all know, Russian disinformation have become a present concern not only for Germany, but for many countries all around the world. And I'm confident that our discussion today will be informative, engaging, and thought-provoking, and only by working together we can develop a comprehensive and effective response to this challenge. And once again, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you, and I hope that you find this conference to be a valuable and enriching experience, and it helps us to move forward in our efforts to counter Russian disinformation in Germany and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, one of our beneficiary. I would kindly invite our very important beneficiary to Daria Gaidai, representing the Deputy Office of Prime Minister. Daria, good to have you here.
Thank you, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank organizers and our partners, EU delegation and team members of the project for putting all this together and for initiating such kind debates, a very important debates. And I would like to recollect the first days of full-scale war that started more than 1 year ago. And remember the first day when, after the first shock, we all started thinking what we can do, what we as citizens can do to help to withstand this aggression. And from the day one, it was clear understanding that there is not only battle on the battlefield, but also battle of, as this event calls, narratives, and also the battle on informational front. We learned the lessons of 2014 when Ukraine and the world were not prepared for this kind of misinformation, of disinformation, and we all felt the results of this unpreparedness. In 2022, last year, we understood the urgent need to unite and to deliver truth about what is going on in Ukraine, to produce real and to work with our partners across Europe to ensure that any disinformation campaign, misinformation campaign are not going to succeed. And Ukrainian communicators from different fields, from different sectors, from civil society, from state institutions, everyone united just to ensure that the world knows what is going on. And while the soldiers were fighting, including around Kiev and fighting the invasion that was going on all around the border with Russia and Belarus, Ukrainian communicators also worked day and night to ensure that the message from Ukraine, that the voice of Ukraine is heard. And this was brought fruitful results, and we know that this time and disinformation was not successful. And together with our partners in Europe, in the United States and other, we managed to ensure that people know what is going on. So this also shows us how important the information in today's world, informational warfare, and that even if you have the win on the battlefield, it should be also supplemented with a clear understanding around your partners about international community, about the situation, about the crimes committed. We all remember the days when the first information about Bucha came to the world news, and there were attempts to undermine the truth, to try to say that this is not the real, that all those footages are fake, but collective efforts and I would say the resilience we have built over the years in fighting disinformation brought the results. And we were able to ensure that the crimes are not hidden, that the truths are there. Also, I would like to welcome and thank my colleagues from Center for Strategic Communication and Informational Security, who are also here today. They were also on this forefront of the struggle for the truth in informational warfare, and they did a huge job. In a few days after the full-scale invasion, their resources turned into trustworthy sources of information. And it also shows that even in such critical times, we were able to be efficient because there was some homework done before that. And when we are in this process for more than a year, we see that we still need to work constantly, systematic, to fight disinformation. The challenges are still there, the threats are still there, and of course we become even more resilient and effective, but in our today world is information space is very fluid and dynamic, and it's not always, we always don't have even time to monitor everything, to know what is going on. And we here in Ukraine, the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister try to monitor the situation in different European countries, because on this depends our survival, but also it's very hard. And we see how some kind of resources that they are not on our radar, but they are spreading disinformation and trying to use every friction we have in relations with our partners just to undermine Ukraine, undermine confidence in Ukraine, and to sow distrust to Ukraine. That's why I very welcome such kind of debate and such kind of project for us to understand that this process is, we need to learn and to adapt to new challenges and to see how we can be effective when we are facing not just like kind of very clear disinformation, but when we are in some kind, when we are faced with narratives that are very carefully prepared, and it's not always easy to confront them, to address them, because sometimes lays very it's rooted in stereotypes, in some perceptions. And now I looking forward to this discussion to to learn about how we can to move for this second stage in our understanding how we build our communication better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria, our strong partners. I kindly invite Mr. Marco Ferraro, our sector manager and the EU representing the European Union delegation in Kiev. Thank you, Marco.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. From my side, I want to extend a word of welcome to all of you, experts in Ukraine and abroad, in this second Battle of Narratives event, which has been organized by the project Capacity Building for Strategic Communication. This project has been launched by the European Union delegation in Ukraine to support capacities for strategic communication of our Ukrainian counterparts. For the European Union, Ukraine has been at the front line, not only since 2022, but since 2014. The destabilization of Ukraine started then. Information warfare and hybrid warfare started then, if not earlier. So Ukraine has been at the forefront of the current struggle between Western values and whatever Russia is offering to the world for at least almost a decade. The post-truth became a word of the year in Oxford Dictionary in 2016 when it became popular due to the presidential elections in the US that year. But actually, this era of post-truth in this part of the world started a few years earlier than that. So the role of the European Union in Ukraine for supporting the country in strategic communication and in countering disinformation has been refined over the course of the years. There has been policy developments at our headquarters in Brussels with the creation of EU Stratcom. And in Ukraine, we have established a portfolio of different types of actions supporting civil society, which in Ukraine, as you know, is very vivid, very vital also in the domain of countering disinformation and supporting the state institutions that we partner with. I think this event of today, which is the second one after the earlier one dedicated to Italy, will help to build bridges between Ukrainian and foreign experts in the domain of fighting information warfare, of countering disinformation, hostile narratives. Ukraine is not only a recipient of support, of help from us, but it is also a partner which has matured, acquired lots of information on the ground. So building this type of bridges and sharing knowledge, as will be done today, is a very useful exercise for all of our community and for EU-Ukraine cooperation. So again, to all of you, thank you for being here, and I wish you a profitable discussion.
Thank you very much, Marco, colleagues. And I am now kindly inviting Dr. Yanis Luge, with whom I had the pleasure to work on the EU project in Russia before the war in public diplomacy, to host this meeting and kick up the discussions. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you very much, Andrei, and thank you to everybody for inviting me to chair today's discussion. And as you know, we have a tight schedule. We have quite a few presentations today, and I will try to make sure that we stick to the timetable and that this event will not keep you from your well-deserved weekend. I would also like to remind everybody to speak slowly, to give the translator time to translate, and that everything is well understood. This event for me personally is very interesting because I like to reflect on a discourse about Ukraine, about Russia, about the war that I am and some of the colleagues here are actually also participants in. So it is a reflection on what is going on. And I think that we can say that the discourse in Germany has indeed fundamentally changed over the last year. because the war was a tremendous shock and it had consequences. So we are now saying things and thinking things which are or were unthinkable before the war. And, you know, perceptions have shifted, at least for a broad majority of Germans. There was a lot of support for Ukraine, it was very visible. And there was also a broad condemnation of Russia's attack. But of course, there are still challenges and there are still battles of narratives ongoing. As also Maria Zahaidak has pointed out in the introduction, there are still vulnerabilities for certain narratives in Germany, certain narratives that come from Russia. And these narratives are different now. They are adapted to the new situation, but it is also important to discuss them. And they still find their way to German minds and German discussions and debates. So this is what we want to look at in the first of our two panels today. Germany as a target for Russian narratives and influence. And I think that we have a great panel of three experts. We have Dr. Andreas Umland from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. We have Dr. Anton Chechovtsov from the Center of Democratic Integrity. And we have Dietmar Pichler from who's the director and a disinformation analyst at the Zentrum für digitale Medienkompetenz, so the Center for Digital Media Competence. It's great that the three of you are here, and the idea is that Andreas will first help us to understand the German background a bit better before Anton tells us a bit more about the Russian narratives which are used and may be successful in Germany. And then Dietmar will show us what he has observed about the success of these narratives in the German-speaking world. And now I would like to give the word to the first presentation to Andreas. Andreas, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Yanis. I want to go a little bit deeper, so to say, into this issue, and perhaps also in a direction that not all may immediately support, and that will be unusually. And I would take as a starting point a theory that I've been communicated by Maxim Trudolyubov with regard to the Russian development over the last 30 years. Trudolyubov has the idea, I think rather persuasive idea, that the root of what we are observing now in Russia, the said development, has to do with the failure to come to terms with the past, with the failure to deal openly and productively and deeply, especially with Stalinism, but also with other dark periods in Russian history. And this failure then has provided the narratives, the background, the stereotypes, the sort of algorithms of thinking that are today supporting the war in Ukraine. And I want to simply apply this sort of explanation and approach to Germany, and to think that, and to propose that we also need to go into another round of what is in Germany called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past with regard to our Eastern policies, Ostpolitik. There are already, I would say, two strings in this direction currently developing in Germany. The first one is focused on Ukraine and the misunderstanding of Ukraine. And I would just mention here as one example of this sort of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, a book by Sabine Adler, the Ukraine and Us, us meaning the Germans, this is a book I've read and can fully recommend, and a book that I have not yet managed to fully read by Markus Wehner and Reinhard Bingener, The Moscow Connection, which is another direction in this coming to terms with the past, which looks critically at the developments over the last 20, 25 5 years. What we need, however, is yet another string of research, I would think, that is perhaps marked so far best by a book by Thomas Urban, a journalist, a correspondent in Eastern Europe, called Biased View, the German Eastern Policies, and that proposes actually to go deeper into history, to reach further back, and to look for the misunderstanding of what has recently happened in Russia, not only against the background of our misunderstanding of Ukraine or of our misunderstanding of post-Soviet Russia, but also on our misunderstanding of the Soviet period and the German policies during the Soviet period. Just to make an example, if I would describe a sad outcome of German foreign policies as Germany does a large gas deal with Moscow, and this is a historic gas deal with Moscow. It's in many ways the most impressive gas deal until then with Moscow. And unfortunately, 9 years later, Moscow decides to invade a foreign country and to undermine Western Moscow relations and to trigger sanctions and to trigger basically a new Cold War. If I tell you this story, if I would tell this story in a student seminar, perhaps most of the students would immediately see this story as the one about Nord Stream 1, a large gas deal 9 years later, a large gas deal that means in 2005, 9 years later, 2014, the invasion of Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. But those of you who are a little bit older and who may already suspecting what I'm hinting at here is that this is actually could be another story. It could be a much earlier story that basically went the same way, namely the story of the so-called Röhrenkredit I, the Tubes Credit 1, a large German Soviet gas deal of 1970 that led actually later on to the construction of the Ukrainian gas transportation system. And 9 years later, Moscow invades Afghanistan, with which then the détente period ends, and that also then introduces a new period in general Soviet-Western relations, a new Cold War, you could argue, with martial law in Poland, with the so-called NATO double decision, NATO Doppelbeschluss, in response to the stationing of the infamous RSD 10 Pioneer, or better known as SS-20, middle-range rockets in above all Belarus and Ukraine in the 1970s, and then leading to an escalation of tensions between the West and the Soviet Union that almost led to World War III in the early 1980s. So in spite of this story, this parallelity between the story of the Röhrenkredit I, the Tubes Credit 1, a large deal between Germany and the Soviet Union concerning the constructions of gas pipelines, and then later on the end of the détente period and the invasion of Afghanistan, 9 years actually, as in the case of Nord Stream 1, which led 9 years later, or did not prevent 9 years later, the invasion of Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. In spite of such parallelities in Germany, we still have, I would say, a myth about the Neue Ostpolitik, which claims not only that, I think wrongly, that the Eastern policies then have created peace, which they did not create, perhaps for Europe to a certain degree, but certainly not for Afghanistan, and which even claims that these policies of the 1970s have magically, I would say, then led to the end of the Cold War in the second half of the 1980s, although by then this policy, this Neue Ostpolitik, had already long ago changed and had been actually then replaced by a totally different policy from the Reagan administration, including the infamous or famous Strategic Defense Initiative, which led to the appointment, which was one of the factors, I think, that led to the appointment of Mikhail Gorbachev, who turned out to be a fortunate person for Western Soviet relations.
Andreas,
So,
I think you will have to conclude rather soon.
Yeah, so I just want to make here this suggestion that I think we have to follow Trudolyubov's suggestion that at the end of the day, I think many of the failures that we see today can be explained by mistakes in the past, and especially by the non-acknowledgements of mistakes that we made in the past, the wrong conclusions we draw from the past, and then the wrong policies that we shaped, that we formulated on the basis of such wrong conclusions from the past. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And I would like to now give the word to Anton. Anton, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yanis. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov. As I was introduced, I'm the director of the Center for Democratic Integrity, which is a non-profit organization based in Austria. We analyze attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. And I want to talk to you, I share some of my ideas about various narratives of the Russian propaganda and disinformation machine in relations to the war against Ukraine. But first of all, I want to add something to the representatives of the Ukrainian government. Just a few days after the escalation of the Russian-Ukrainian war in February 2022, so last year, the European Union decided to block some of the Russian state-controlled media channels, such as RT, which was previously known as Russia Today, and Sputnik. But 1 year after, and everybody keeps saying for some reason that these resources are blocked. Well, they were blocked only for 1 year. Now they're completely back. You can access them from Germany, from any European country, EU country. Sputnik, the German version of Sputnik is back. The German version of RT is back. So they are not blocked anymore. And Russia has a free hand again to spread disinformation in German language. So this is one correction. But back to what I want to talk about, and this is tactical and strategic narratives. I do believe that in order to successfully counter the narratives and in the end successfully counter the disinformation and propaganda of the Russian Federation, we do need to distinguish between tactical and strategic narratives. So what are strategic narratives? Strategic narratives reflect the long-term vision of Russian political and kinetic warfare. And more often than not, these strategic narratives reflect genuine, deep-seated beliefs of the Russian leadership linked to Ukraine or the broader context of this aggression. Tactical narratives serve as individual steps that aim to strengthen the validity of strategic narratives. But the difference between them is not only that first, all the strategic narratives, they are more of they reflect genuine beliefs. Also, they are more or less, these strategic narratives demonstrate some sort of internal logic and are generally coherent. It doesn't mean that they are right or that they're correct, but it means that they are quite well structured and elaborate. But tactical narratives, because they are these individual steps, very often they are illogical, or they may even contradict each other, because their only role is to contribute to the force of strategic narratives. And this is why they are very often, they are irrational, they are inconsistent, they are emotional, And because of this, they may emerge, they may disappear, and then they may re-emerge again. So these are not like strategic narratives which stay the same. Why I am distinguishing between strategic and tactical narratives is because, in my opinion, sometimes it doesn't make sense really to counter some of the tactical narratives, because they may be inconsistent, and when we are trying to counter them, when we are trying to debunk all those disinformation ideas, the Russians will come up with 10 new or 20 new disinformation narratives. If we're talking about tactical narratives, strategic narrative stays the same. Tactical may change, and again, they may contradict each other. They are emotional. So we don't need often, well, probably governmental structures need to address some of the lies and disinformation that are being spread. But various organizations, especially civil society organizations, they don't need to counter every tactical narrative spread by the Russian propaganda machine. Also, I do believe that it is important also to distinguish between audiences. Today we're talking about Russian propaganda machine and the use of the German context, of the German environment. But we again need to understand that the Russian propaganda machine in general targets for very different audiences. And depending on what narratives, strategic and tactical narratives, what audience they target, we also need to take this into consideration when we are thinking about our counter strategies against this disinformation. So in general, I distinguish between 4 different audiences. One audience is Russian domestic audience. The second audience is the Ukrainian audience. The third audience is the West, where Germany also belongs, and then the global South, which is the 4th audience. And sometimes these strategic and tactical narratives, sometimes they overlap between these different audiences, but usually, especially with strategic ones, and sometimes also with tactical, we see different narratives. And I want to give you some examples of these different narratives that are targeting specific audiences. So, for example, for the Russian domestic audience, the Russian propaganda machine needs to explain that the Ukrainian nation does not exist, that Ukraine as an independent state was granted existence by Russia, and also sovereign Ukraine is a project of anti-Russia. So these are strategic narratives which are very often used. But then there are many tactical narratives, such as Ukrainians opposing, for example, Ukraine's leaders are Satanists. We sometimes hear these quite ridiculous ideas and messages. They call this special military operation. They don't want to, the Russian authorities don't want to, additionally frighten the Russian population. So these are smaller individual steps, these tactical narratives. For the Ukrainian audience, they have a different set of strategic narratives, such as, for example, Russians and Ukrainians are brotherly nations. They forget, for speaking to Ukrainians, they forget that for the Russian audience, they say that the Ukrainian nation does not exist. No, they're saying that these are brotherly nations, that Ukraine is part of the greater Russian civilization. So these are strategic narratives. But of course, there are also tactical narratives, such as that the West is degenerate, Ukraine should not join this gay Europa. This image of Europe as led by LGBT and other evils in the view of Moscow.
Anton, I think it would be good to focus on the narratives for the West and then conclude, so we can go on. Thank you very much.
So for the West, actually, I would say that predominantly Russia is trying to target the West, because it is the West that helps Ukraine to fight a defensive war against the Russian Federation. So these strategic narratives, which are, I think, very important, and this is where I believe the civil society, but also some political forces and officials need to work more closely. The strategic narratives, first, is that Russia is a global power that has a right to have its own sphere of influence, and Ukraine belongs to that sphere of influence. The second strategic narrative is that Ukraine, as part of the West, poses an existential threat to Russia. And the third one, the third strategic narrative, is that the West is using NATO to encircle Russia. And in the West in general, and in Germany in particular, also there are many tactical narratives, again, that are used as these individual steps to strengthen the power of strategic narratives. And I will name some of them. For example, the West attacks Russia because of inherent Western Russophobia or anti-Russian sentiment. Ukraine is run by Nazis. Western sanctions are damaging for European, German businesses and households. Germany and Russia could go back to business as usual. Russia is not trying to attack Germany. Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Russia is interested in peace negotiations, but Ukraine and the West and the Americans and the Germans are not interested in peace. European support for Ukraine will result in the geopolitical decline of Europe. Major countries of Europe, such as Germany, such as the UK and France and Italy, will suffer because they support Ukraine. And another tactical narrative: the US uses the Ukraine war to cement its position as the dominant power. So again, they are trying to convince major European powers that the US is the only power that is benefiting from this support for Ukraine. Again, Western in general and German in particular, weapons given to Ukraine will end up with international terrorists, or they prolong the war. And of course, one of the major tactical narratives is this nuclear threat, that the West should not oppose Russia because it has nuclear weapons, or, for example, Ukraine is making a dirty bomb. And this is a tactical narrative that, again, it emerges, it sometimes disappears, and then re-emerges again. And basically, we can say the same about other tactical narratives. They're very fluid, yes. And going back to what I said before, is that we don't need to counter every and each of them. Yeah. Rather, we should, I think, focus on the importance to counter the strategic narratives, because then it would be possible for populations for societies to understand that those Russian disinformation tactical narratives, they are just, these small lies that try to strengthen the big lie. I don't probably have time anymore. No.
Not right now, but maybe in the Q&A we will get some more.
All right.
Thank you very much. That was quite insightful, and yeah, I can confirm that all of these narratives are really important in German discourse right now. I would like to understand better how well they are actually catching on in Germany, and this is why I'm glad that we have Dietmar Pichler here, who's observing exactly that. So I would like to give the floor to Dietmar.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. I would like to introduce myself in a different way, maybe to tell you where my story begins. And it all began regarding the topic of Russian disinformation, not in 2014. I had it on my radar, of course, before. It was already an issue, but especially after I returned from Kyiv, from Euromaidan, I came back to Vienna and I couldn't trust my ears what kind of disinformation was present in all parts of society. And also, I have to say, in mass media, it was not only Russia Today and Sputnik. Yeah, this is a kind of false assumption that if we cut off Russia Today and Sputnik, we cut off Russian disinformation. It's a very important channel for them, of course, but it was everywhere. It was in mainstream media. It was in quality media. It was very shocking. And what I also saw and what I still see is that, what also the previous speakers mentioned, that we have a serious lack of understanding regarding Russia. What is the domestic situation? What is the propaganda? What is the genocidal rhetorics, for instance, in state TV? But we have even more a lack of understanding what Ukraine actually is, what the Ukrainian people, how they live, how society works. And I would like to just tell you a little bit about the main narratives that I observed. So first of all, I think the biggest impact, what many people don't have on their radar, is still, it's everything about 2014. When I see people, real people, not Russian trolls, justifying the Russian invasion, they always, or in many cases, mention 2014. They tell a 180-degree flipped version of what actually happened. The same they do about, for instance, the annexation of Crimea. This was something that the Western audience or the German-speaking audience even understood a little bit better. But this hidden, I mean, in our eyes, not very well hidden invasion of Donbass in 2014, this is something that even people who strongly support Ukraine in the German-speaking world do not have on their radar. There is almost no information about it. As long as not everybody knows who Igor Girkin, Alexander Baradai, or Arsen Motorola Pavlov were, that we will not have the discourse that we need. There is also another problem, that in the German-speaking world, we have a lack of understanding what occupation regime means. We have the peace movement, which consists of the far left, or like say, some naive figures, and they are very influenced even by the Soviet propaganda back during the Cold War. When they fought, it's only the West that is aggressive, and Russia, or back then the Soviet Union, is just reacting. We have the same here, and what I observed, even the same actors that were active during the peace movement of the 80s or 70s are active now and justifying Russia, telling that it's the fault of NATO, of the West, or even of Ukraine, because they wanted to be part of the democratic world. Then we have, of course, the far right. Everybody knows about it. This is something that we have in addition. And what I can see, not only on social media, but also on protests all around in Germany, in Austria, that the far left and the far right is even marching together in the support of this narrative that the West is aggressive, that the West is to blame, that Ukraine is to blame for the war in Ukraine. There is a difference between the Soviet times and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, or the Russian war against Ukraine, that we have a hot war now, not in Europe, not comparable exactly to what we saw back then. And we still hear the same narratives, which is quite a shame, because it doesn't make any sense, you would say, in the first place. I heard from some people who have a psychological background that it's very difficult to change an opinion, to change an ideology that you held fond for many decades. Maybe this is one reason to explain this phenomenon. And then Satanists, the desatanization was mentioned before. I think this is very interesting, because I also witnessed that when Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda is using these extremely ridiculous claims, this for the Western audience, I think it's not very effective. It will not influence us as much as it could influence even the radical part in Russia. Then it also has another purpose. If you hear this ridiculous propaganda, and we have the denazification, we have the terror mosquitoes and everything else, then there are people in Germany, in Austria, who say, okay, I understand. this is Russian propaganda. This is, of course, they do propaganda. Then they say what is wrong, that all sides do propaganda on the same level. And they think that other Russian narratives, that other disinformation pieces, it doesn't matter if on the strategic level or on the tactical level, that they think they need to be true, because if they sound less ridiculous, they think, okay, now Putin is telling the truth, that something else was ridiculous, something by Medvedev, but Putin, he has a suit, he seems so calm. That is, now they are not lying. Yeah? But this is the great danger I see. What we also had even days before the invasion. And if you ask me how these disinformation pieces are delivered so well, to close my remark, is it was even in our mass media that we used quotes by Russian officials, and we did not give them any context. We didn't say Putin or the Russian regime claims to feel threatened by NATO. We said they feel threatened by NATO. A very, very slight difference in the sentence, but a huge difference in the perception of reality. And this is how they were able to deliver all their narratives before the invasion, and we still see the impact of it.
Thank you very much, Dietmar. First of all, also to stay in the time frame, but also for a very interesting presentation. And I think there are some questions that you will return to in the second part of this event, for example, about giving context to official Russian statements. I have a couple of questions for the speakers, but if there's any questions, in the among the viewers, you can enter it in the Q&A chat, and I will pick it up. We have a couple of minutes left until 4 o'clock, and I, would like to address one question to Andreas. You spoke of the sort of the ideological heritage that we have in today's discourse. And I was wondering how much that is tied to certain individuals, let's say people who are supporting Ostpolitik more or less, or have supported in the SPD, for example, or in other parties, or is that something that is, passed on to new generations of younger politicians as well? This would be my question to Andreas. I will also address one question to Anton. These narratives, they seem to be quite refined and smart. So I was wondering, how are they actually produced? Is it trial and error? Is it more systematic? And how does it also, and maybe this is also a question for Dietmar, how does the Russian propaganda interact with the German ecosystem of conspiracy theorists and anti-elite actors? Because it seems to be more of a, not just the Russians, but seems to be like a mixture, sort of a toxic mixture, where Russian, narratives play a role, but maybe are not the only factor. So this would be my question. I would say we go through in the same order. So Andreas, I would start with you about, is it individuals or is the heritage being passed on to new generations?
I would rather think it is a larger problem. I think this individual question is actually dealt with in the books that I mentioned by Sabine Adler, Markus Wehner, and what was the name? I can't remember the co-author of Markus Wehner. They actually deal a lot with the individuals. However, my suggestion here was, because I wanted to go a little bit beyond what is currently the debate in Germany. My issue here is that we have a rather larger problem in our Vergangenheitspolitik, in our Geschichtspolitik, in that we have a mystification of the new Ostpolitik as a sort of peace-bringing approach. And the usual explanation one hears then is, well, it didn't work this time because this time we have a revisionist power. Well, back then we had actually a status quo power. And that's why it didn't work this way, this time. But actually it didn't work back then either. In 1973, when when the Ukrainian, well, what later became the Ukrainian gas transportation system started to work, and when the first CSCE conference was held. In the same year, the Soviet Union started developing the SS-20 missiles. Yeah, so and then we had this escalation as a result of that, and we had the Afghanistan. So it didn't really work then, and the reason that it didn't work now is not that Russia has become so different. It has actually stayed the same. It was imperial before Soviet power. It was imperial during the Soviet period, and it remains imperial until today. And we had back then the wrong approach, and we have now still not understood that we then had the wrong approach, and we had recently then drawing the wrong lessons from the 1970s. Again, the wrong approach. So I think it's actually much deeper. It's not just some people like Schröder or Foscherau who got money basically for their positions or their sort of political sons like Steinmeier. Although not all of them, like Lars Klingbeil, actually then follow them in this. So it's not just this sort of SPD circle. It's a larger problem, I think, going even into the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung and institutions like that who have Vergangenheitsbewältigung as their political task.
Thank you very much. And maybe Anton, a little bit about how these narratives are created, and then Dietmar about how it interacts with our local actors. And also I would like to ask you to be as brief as possible. Thank you very much.
Well, I would say that these narratives that they are created by a number or by a range of various actors. And in general, I would say that these actors are these are Russian officials. Especially if we're talking about foreign audiences, here the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs is very important. What Lavrov is saying, what Maria Zakharova is saying. So these are the official aspect here. Then you have the state-controlled media or state-sponsored media, again, such as RT and Sputnik. What happened actually during 2022, when the European Union decided to block, well, as I told, only for 1 year, the various editions of RT and Sputnik News, what they did is that first they still operated on this sort of underground level. They would have different names for their websites that you could access them. Their Telegram channels were still running, but what they did, their new invention was that they tried to cooperate with individual bloggers, individual influencers in the West who would not have any official connection to the Russian state-controlled media. They realized that it was much more efficient to have those people, to have those agents who would not be affiliated again, and spread messages that they would be otherwise produced through the websites or through the TV channels. So this is what they started doing. Then you have also political entrepreneurs, Russian political entrepreneurs, who know what the Kremlin award you for, and obviously the Kremlin could grant some benefits to the Russian actors who are not necessarily directly connected to the Kremlin, but who act on their own as freelancers. Again, these political entrepreneurs, and they themselves target particular audiences, including those in the West, including those in Germany, France, and of course, this is for them. It's their own business, and then again, you have, yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Marco, is it a two-finger urgent question? Then you can get in right now.
If we have time, otherwise
we are already in the 5-minute technical break. I will extend it. I think we can have 2 more minutes if you have a brief question.
A question for Anton on this production. Well, Anton, you explained now about the production of narratives, but what about the reception in the West? How much of the reception by local actors in the West is genuine, and how much is instead genuine based, meaning on ideological affinity, and how much instead is based on structured cooperation? How much is it spontaneous, and how much is it driven by cooperation?
I would say
much
that
for the question. And
Anton,
you want to answer right away? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So yeah.
Very briefly, I don't really. I don't see the how to say much of a sense in distinguishing between ideological perceptions and some structural based or structure based perceptions, because in the end they all when these messages are being spread, when they are being distributed, it doesn't really matter what lies behind the idea of spreading them. So I wouldn't focus too much on this. But of course, if we're talking about ideology, this is not necessarily pro-Russian and pro-Russian ideology. Although in the West and in Germany, we have this aspect of pro-Russian ideology or doctrines or ideas and messages. But it's mostly driven by anti-Americanism. It's mostly driven by anti-globalist thinking, some radical anti-globalist thinking, sometimes even anti-capitalist, despite the fact that Russia is actually a wildly capitalist society, country. And also these anti-Western, anti-liberal ideas. And this is where you have this overlap. So ideology, yes, but obviously, there are also some agents that work with the Russians, but again, ideological convictions are, I think, almost always present here as well, because these people need to rationalize why they are doing this, and obviously they come up with very often they come up with ideological interpretations of their own work to the benefit of the Russian foreign policy interests.
Thank you very much, Anton. And now Dietmar, to the question of interaction with local actors and activities.
Yeah, you mentioned conspiracy theory believers, and I think they are a very important group because they were already active in 2014. And as mentioned before, they have this anti-globalist and so-called anti-capitalist, anti-Western, anti-USA agenda. And you don't even need to pay them. They believe everything that you feed them with. And I remember in 2014, they had several topics because Ukraine was a huge topic for them, the anti-Ukrainian agenda, but they had also other things like against vaccines, what they have now as well. So it's maybe not a great example, but also against Jews, so not well hidden anti-Semitism and stuff like that. Rockefeller, they had all these buzzwords they used, and when we compare it to now and all these movements that are quite integrated now, they are more organized than they have been before, which makes them more efficient in 2023. And what we see is that they are very, very much focused now on Ukraine, on spreading Russian narratives, which makes it a much bigger institution than it used to be. And I think we should keep that in mind, that not everybody who is very actively spreading Russian narratives is paid, unfortunately, even if I would really like to know who is paid, because then we don't need the efforts to try to debunk or to change his or her opinion anymore.
Thank you very much. And this concludes the first part of our event today. So in the second part of this event, we will look a bit closer to the challenges also that the media landscape faces in Germany, that journalists face in covering these sometimes very controversial issues, with a specific focus also how Ukraine is represented in German media in the discourse. and we'll try to draw some conclusions about what kind of challenge this poses for Ukraine as this war continues. So I'm very happy to introduce the second panel with Dr. Gesine Dornblüt, an independent journalist and a very well-known voice in the German, in German media commenting, working on Russia for a very long time, and having lived in Russia as a former Deutschlandradio correspondent in Moscow. And then we have Andrei Kusi and Ksenia Ilyuk, Andrei Kusi is the co-founder of Let's Data, and Ksenia Ilyuk is the head of research of Detector Media. And finally, we have Ina Nellis, who is the founder of the German Ukrainian Bureau. And I would like to start by giving the word to Gesine Dornblüt. Gesine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. The previous speakers already mentioned the need for the context in media to say why and what is the background for certain statements, for example, by Russian officials. And I'm very proud and very glad to be in the position to have the possibility to give this context. I'm working in a team of former and current Moscow and Poland and Ukraine correspondents who are organizing talks almost every morning in every morning show in Deutschlandradio. We are presenting news and giving context, and I think this is quite unique in the German media landscape. But nevertheless, those narratives mentioned earlier, they are there. They are also there in our programs. And I would like to share some thoughts, what bothers me and how I think that we could improve our work. And I will now switch into German because one of the problems I would like to focus on is wording. And I think you will benefit more if I speak German, and those who understand German will know what I'm talking about, and I prefer to rely on proper translation.
So I'll restrict myself to the so-called quality media. And firstly, I'd like to say that the wrong wording is a big problem, and I will mention a few problems. One of this was already mentioned. This is a 1-year war. This is actually not the 1-year war. This is a 9-year war. It has been lasting since 2014. This is actually a Russian war against Ukraine, and we also talk about the Ukrainian conflict, and we should rather talk about aggressive invasion of Russia against Ukraine since 2014. And also the separatists or separatist areas are already well founded notions, and that these are actually Russian occupied areas, and this means that we need to talk about separatists. And just a while ago, we talked about the planned Russian referendums, but actually in these occupied areas, such referendums cannot take place. And we can say that the separatists want to mock a referendum, but in order to understand that, in order to be aware of that, you need time to understand that such words can be problematic, and this is great strength for the media, especially when being overloaded with so many information and knowing that so many journalists have to handle so many different topics, and there are not just specialists on Eastern Europe there, and they are very often dependent on the information agencies and information agencies are a big part of the problem in case of the war of Ukraine. And I'll mention one problem just a while ago, a few weeks ago, when we talked about a person killed in St. Petersburg. And it was called as a war correspondent was killed, but it was actually a criminal. It was actually a supporter of aggressive war against Ukraine. And the German information agency said that this is a 40-year-old war journalist and a blogger. And I've been following the news. And my colleagues under time pressure also very often take over the wordings of the Russian information agencies, and they very often talk about the war correspondent, bloggers and journalists.
So the agencies are one of the problems. And what is helpful here is what you've already talked about and what my colleagues talk about, and I always mention it, that there is great uncertainty actually. And this is not malicious. This is what I can say from my own experience. It's about being uncertain, about not having enough time, that people make those mistakes, and that as a result lead to the fact that those Russian narratives spread, and they also continue in the German society. So apart from the wording, the next serious problem is a false balance. Because journalism in democracies follows a Saxonian school. So one party said this, the other party said that. In Germany, balance is a big goal, and journalists should avoid taking sides. And I'm returning to the point that I mentioned at the very beginning. For example, making quotations of Lavrov, of Putin, and in particular, in the news, which are short, it's very difficult to give context, and often instead of offering neutral comment, you start personalizing your comments. So it is obligatory to say actually what a given politician said. However, you should always put it in context. And also, reports from the front, when it comes to reports from the front, in the first months of attack, we often said, well, we are not able to verify it. It's not verifiable. It's just as in the case of advertisements of medicines. Always ask your pharmacist in the case of side effects. So if one journalist says it's raining, the other is saying that the sun is shining, the task of a proper journalist is to check, look out and see what the weather is like. So sometimes it's worth to wait and check, because very often the events come in open source data after several days, and you can check them more precisely. But the dynamics of the media is really fast, and as a result, if you report several days after, no one's really interested in that. And another example, which I experienced several months ago, a question of my colleague in discussion live. He said, oh, there are reports on crimes of Ukrainians. Oh, it sounded like, oh, finally there are reports of crimes also on the other side. So there is this striving at balance, at striking balance in reporting. And this is the phenomenon that I keep observing. And you can comment on that. And the biggest problem that I see is the false balance when choosing experts for debates. So generally speaking, and I'm coming to the end, when it comes to deliveries of weapons, a vast majority, if not all experts, are for deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. But in Germany, there are a lot of voices against, and often in public channels, in public radios or public media, the reports, well, they say we need someone who has a different opinion, who's against deliveries of weapons. And in my opinion, mechanisms work here that are really difficult to break. And here I would like to make a full stop.
Thank you very much, Gesine. I would like to now give the floor. I was still in the German setting. So I would like to give the floor to Andrei and Ksenia. I see you're both on the same screen. So you have the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. We're co-founders of Let's Data, AI solution anticipating communication risks and opportunities. And we will share with you some of the key insights on the monitoring of media environment of Germany around Ukraine.
So I think we are looking into the information on the media discourse quite quantifiably. And since we've been monitoring the media discourse in Europe and in 40 other countries since the beginning of the invasion, and we see that Germany always has a very leading and very far lead in the amount of publication mentioning Ukraine, in the amount of publication that have anything concerning Ukraine. As you can see, it's far ahead of France or any other country in the EU, and it's quite steady. Here you can see just a sample of the last two months, which we've chosen from December 19th to, actually it's from December 19th to February 19th, so it's not last, but it's like 2 months that have been particularly interesting. And you can see it's quite steady, so it's always, Ukraine is always on the in demand and mentioned. But one of the things which is particular to Germany is that not that many of those publications are about Russian invasion of Ukraine. So a lot, 70% of the publications, they're just mentioning Russian invasion of Ukraine, matter of fact, as a side thing, and often, very often, they are mentioning it as a in some of a negative connotation, especially in the topics of economics. So basically, most of the mentions would be the prices are going up because of conflict in Ukraine or because of war in Ukraine. And this matter of fact mentions of some negative events happening being related to Russian invasion, which is often called or just war in Ukraine or Ukrainian war or Ukrainian conflict, is a majority, while only 30% is concerning really coverage of the topics or coverage of the events. So that's one of the particular things that is a bit different from some other countries. Another thing is we see that media of all ranks and sizes are talking about war in Ukraine, unlike other countries like France or Italy, where you have a distribution of more mid-sized media that being very active in Ukraine, but others being less. Here we can see quite a steady, quite a normal distribution. So everyone is covering the topic. And I think here it's important to say that not that we don't see any very openly pro-Russian media discourse going into there, but we see lots of media discourse which is rather pacifist or very anti-war oriented, or we see a lot of media discourse of people who are not actively supporting Russia, but who are rather saying that we shouldn't support Ukraine that much. So we usually would call them for example, in the context of tank delivery, we don't have many people saying Russia is right, but we are having lots of people saying the tank delivery is wrong, and that's not supporting Ukraine.
And here we have just a few numbers, interesting comparison numbers that kind of characterize the discourse around Ukraine in numbers and publications. And here, one of the things I would like to focus is kind of a let's call it a communication risk, communication opportunity for Ukraine. Is if you look in the last numbers about publication concerning EU and NATO, it's what we could clearly see when discussing Ukraine overall in the media, especially in the opinion pieces and analytical pieces, because it's not just the news concerning Ukraine. We see a lot of this discussion of Germany being presented as the leader of European Union and the leader of NATO, and trying to talk about Ukraine within NATO or EU from the perspective of this leadership of Germany. And this was something that was always receiving quite a lot of traction in terms of views and overall. And this is kind of an interesting opportunity from the perspective of how we could cover the topics of Ukraine and in terms of NATO, EU, and Germany, and relations with Germany overall. And also, what is interesting, it was already discussed today about the citation of Russian media, and we have some numbers on that, like basically quantification, and you could clearly see that in Europe, mostly Germany and Austria are leading on the direct translation, direct citation of key Russian media. It's like 5% of all of the materials concerning Ukraine has the direct citation of Russian media, which is, I mean, 5% doesn't sound much, but trust me, it's a lot. Here we are talking about like a few thousands of publications per month, basically. And what is very interesting, if we look into details, we have some data in terms of what key Russian media they are quoting is, and this is something that was also a bit touched today, like how they are citing the Russian media and how they are citing, and lots of this citation, they are actually about quoting Putin, Lavrov, or Medvedev, and quite often, unfortunately, most of the cases, these are quotations without any context, or these are the quotations that, unfortunately, but like most of the quotations like this, they are just a piece of news that are like Lavrov said, Medvedev said, just like a news about what they said. And the biggest even problem that quite often their quote is used as a title, and in the title there is no context, of course, or a very little of content. So basically we have so many articles quite often having basically pieces of pro-Russian rhetoric, or sometimes quite obvious Russian propaganda just in the title. And you know, lots of these studies that showing that majority of the readers are just scanning the title and not even going into the articles. And that's kind of a problem, because even in a lot of that articles, if you go in the article, the journalists are doing a great job because they give the contents in the article, but then you just see the title, and unfortunately title gives the directly opposite impression and delivers the directly opposite message. And overall, in terms of this, it's that's how most of the talks, that the most pro-Russian rhetoric within German media is within the talks about pacifism. There is a lot of speculations, wrong speculations with the term of pacifism and how it should be applied to Ukraine. This is the one part, and the other part, also quite interesting, that we noted that revolves around the citation of Russian media and the presence of Russian speakers commenting on Ukraine, is that there is a very clear distinction in the German media that is not that present in other European countries, is that there is, and this is the very pro-Russian rhetoric, that there is a Russian regime and there are like allegedly Russian people, like ordinary people, and German media quite often try to portray them as completely not connected things, saying that the regime is to blame, while writing different pieces, trying to separate the regime from the so-called ordinary Russian people in that regard. So I think these are like the main takeaways from our side in terms of the German media discourse around Ukraine, and we would be very glad to answer the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andriy and Xenia. That was fascinating. And I would like to give the floor now to Ina Nellis. I'm very curious about what all of this means for the challenges for Ukraine. Ina, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. My name is Ina Nellis, and I'm wearing few hats. I'm Ukrainian advocacy specialist and activist and journalist, and a researcher here in Germany for 1 year. I'm the co-founder of 2 different NGOs. One is Public Interest Journalism Lab, which works in Ukraine, and the second one is German-Ukrainian Bureau, which makes an advocacy and informational campaign research here in Germany. So when I think about the communication aspect of the war, of the long-term war, which is the topic of my speech, I'm kind of thinking from the perspective of both a researcher and a practitioner. And maybe today I will focus more in my recommendation what goes beyond the topics which previous speakers already mentioned, and will more focus on the recommendations to Ukrainian side, what can be done in a different way abroad, especially in Germany, to break through this informational flow and to debunk strategic Russian narratives in Germany in particular. So when we are thinking about this war, probably we're talking about long-term conflict. And the main question and dilemma for me is whether the communication of Ukraine abroad, the communication of German officials in German media for German society is sustainable enough to ensure long-term support of Ukraine. Because there is a fatigue, there is a big informational flow, there are a lot of other topics. Colleagues presented the data, like in which context Ukraine is mentioned. Sometimes it's just like the to be blamed in all consequences of everything bad happening in EU, while it's not a Ukrainian fault. As Gesina said, it's not a Ukrainian war, it's a war of aggression of Russia in Europe against Ukraine. So wording is important. That's why I'm thinking like, why is it so, and what has to be done to ensure the sustainability of communication, not only in media, but also through other instruments. As Andreas already gave us some historical context, of course, everything happened and started between Germany and Ukraine not a year ago. And our relations between Germany and Ukraine, they are influenced by the mistakes of Ostpolitik, which are not reflected in Germany, which are not discussed in Germany, which were always only Russia-centered. Also, this historical guilt projection only on Russia, as after the Second World War, not on other countries which were former USSR republics. So it's a very long historical tradition standing behind it. And till the Euromaidan, till 2014, Ukraine was so-called terra incognita on a German mental map. And it was something seen only through the prism of Russia, or as a bridge to Russia, and I don't know, gas transit country, Chernobyl maximum. And only after 2014, we started to explain what are we as a society and why we are not Russian. And of course, the last year of the full-scale invasion, it was also full of different disappointments and miscommunications. We, as a German-Ukrainian Bureau, we made a study based on more than a dozen in-depth interviews with analysts, with decision makers from Germany and German and Ukrainian side. The study is called Stained by War, Tensions, Expectations, and Ways of Strengthening German-Ukrainian Relations. So I do have also the quality data to speak about what was wrong. And of course, there were a lot of mis-expectations and misperceptions from both sides. From Ukrainian side, we expected German clear leadership in providing us with heavy weaponry, clear position of German leadership from the very beginning that you are for Ukrainian victory, not only against Russian victory. And at the same time, Germany, being one of the biggest donor of Ukraine in a non-military aspect, felt that their support of Ukraine is not appreciated enough. Also, we need to understand that we communicate in a very different way, and President Zelensky, with his charisma, with his, let's say, non-orthodox approach to diplomacy, was an alien to German media and to German political leadership. It took time to understand that he is actually a legitimate leader and he knows what he said. But now it already works better, and we can say that in 1 year these relations have changed. So what can be done in a different way covering this war? One of the main tasks which we have now is not to allow this conflict to be frozen, and to explain that even a day under Russian occupation means no rule of law, means torture, means death. So Russia tries to push us into any kind of peace negotiations while there is nothing to discuss, while they are standing on our land. And my native town is occupied for 9 years. I do understand what Russia propaganda makes on their territories and what happens to Ukrainian activists over there and the people with pro-Ukrainian position. So we need to create a new narrative about Ukrainian victory. Why is it clearly in the interest of Europe and the interest of Germany? One of the messages you can see on the walls in Berlin: this is not our war. And then it's crossed, doch. Yes, it is our war, because this is something bigger than the war against Ukraine. And Russia positioned this war as the war of the West against Russia. Again, they are victims, they started nothing, they just like answering the aggression of NATO, as Anton already mentioned. But we need to explain that this is actually something bigger than just what is called localized conflict, for which European taxpayers should not pay. No, the consequences and cost of non-doing and not supporting Ukraine is very high, and these consequences can ruin the whole Western order after the Second World War, and that's why it has to be protected. And I think one of the main things is by actions, by tribunal, by clear political messaging to ruin the concept of Russian impunity. Because this is what allows them to do everything for years, like Andreas said, from Afghanistan, from Moldova, from Georgia, from Ukraine, all these conflicts, and no responsibility for any of them for Russia as a state. We also try, as a PIJL, as a Ukrainian lab who works in journalism, we try to put a light on other aspects of war, and to explain why we Ukrainians believe without any alternatives in our victory, because we are not naive, but because we are there on the ground and we see what happens. And war is not only about ruins and blood. War also gives you a lot of thousands of inspiring stories of resistance of Ukrainians, which gives the readers of media other motivation to support Ukraine. There are startups, there are scientific discoveries, there are cultural events going in parallel with war. And this is what we cover with Life in War project, a multimedia platform covering such stories. And for example, we already have a partnership with Austrian public broadcaster who found us themselves as a source of other aspects of war information, and they do translate the best stories into German language and spread it for their leaders. So we need kind of through personal stories, through personal approach, through multimedia format, bring this news to the readers of German-speaking media. Another important message is destroying the fear, because Russia do manipulate with fear. One of them is nuclear fear, especially in Germany, and explain why and how does it work. And one probably, I see that I already overtook my time, but it's very important that stakeholder speaks to the same stakeholder. And we remember in Germany there was a very quite big debate in the feministic community with some very controversial letters published in journals again about pacifism and so on and so forth. So Ukrainian feminists should explain to German feminists, having the trust at the basics of the same expertise, or that what is wrong with such statements. And of course, it leads us to the necessity of building a trade or strengthening relations between Ukrainian and German intellectuals. And the most important, decoupling Ukraine from Russia and from Soviet Union in the mental map of Germans. Because we are still perceived being a part of Russian world, and that's how we support one of the strategic narratives of Russian propaganda. So we need to tell a story about a separate nation, about a functional democracy in times of war. We need to explain our values, and I think this is where the big floor is for Ukrainian Institute as the cultural agency of Ukrainian government, who has the first office opened abroad, and it's in Berlin. And I think we need to work more and to build ties among young leaders of two other countries, invest into the generation with which in 20 years will take the leadership, will make decisions, and which has to be free of myths about Russia and its right to influence its neighbors who are sovereign states. So probably I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ina. That was also very fascinating. And yeah, I would like to add one example that I always notice about the so-called senseless fighting on the front line, because many German observers see that there are so many people killed every day, and it is seen as something which has to stop. And on the first instance, you can understand this, but I think here it's also a question of framing, because it is not just senseless fighting, but it is it's securing millions of Ukrainians, and it's successfully protecting. So to show that it's not just about people killing each other, but that it's actually about defense is, I think, a very important narrative. Yet somehow has to be more successful in Germany. I will open the floor now, and I see a hand by Andre. Andre, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Yes, fascinating presentation. I have questions for Gesine, but also the others can respond about the side effects of countering hostile actions and propaganda. I'm a social scientist, so I observe the way it works. And my question would be, what would be an example of failed approach to counter a hostile propaganda, something that we have done and that hasn't worked or even has been counterproductive? And I'm going to give you just one example. Maybe you have the same in Germany. When the war started, we had obviously many people being in solidarity with Ukraine, and we had a company in my country that is providing water, and they're very unpopular because they charge a lot of prices, and their app for payment doesn't work. And some they sometimes you pay and you don't get the proper receipt. And some marketing people obviously jump on the occasion, and they just brand the whole company with the Ukrainian flag. We support Ukraine. We stand by Ukraine. Donate to Ukraine. And that created basically was not helpful for Ukraine because the company app in itself and the company was very unpopular, and they trying to jump on the Ukrainian train and bring of the Ukrainian solidarity to support them. That's, for me, was an example of counterproductive strategy. Obviously, Ukraine has no fault in that. It was totally a marketing decision, nothing to blame Ukraine. But that's one example I see, and I was wondering if you have other example of failed, things that haven't worked or have been counterproductive to fight hostile propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. We can also think about successful strategies, things that did work and were sort of an antidote against propaganda. I will just quickly check. Right now, I don't see any additional questions, but I would like to maybe add one or two myself. And then we have sort of a final round where everybody gets to answer these questions. To Gesine, I would like to add one thought or question. Some people say that, yes, of course, the experts that we have on television shows, which are arguing against arms deliveries, for example, they are not really experts on security policy, and they may be just opportunistic. But because this is a discourse which is going on in society, we somehow have to create a representation of that to also, if these discussions are going on in private kitchens or at the dinner table, that, the television is not detached from what is actually discussed in the society. And that, for example, it is good for someone to see how, these so-called experts are dismantled by real experts and with which arguments that is happening. So I would like to know from you how you think about it, if that, this is, could be an argument in support of false balance. And maybe to Andre and Ksenia, I think it was fascinating to see the different sources that are used across different countries. And I was wondering if you have any hypotheses or idea of why that is the case, maybe from what kind of articles are quoted from these different news agencies, and because it was quite striking to see how different these quoting habits are actually across Europe. And then maybe to Inna, I think that I fully agree that there's the real challenges are probably still ahead. If Ukraine goes on the counteroffensive and will try to regain cities, then there will be a lot of destruction. And for some Germans, it will be like, now Ukrainians are destroying the cities, and why is it even necessary, and so on. So I think this is going to be a huge challenge if Ukraine is successful with this counteroffensive. But I was wondering also, maybe a little provocative question, this information fatigue, that we are not talking about arms delivery so much anymore, and not just debating financial support and so on anymore. It's sort of a technocratic process. Isn't that maybe even good for Ukraine? Because at least, the support is flowing. The decisions, the so-called red lines have been crossed regarding arms deliveries. So this is my question. What is the risk of information fatigue? What could be the negative outcome from this for Ukraine? I would like to go in the same order as the presentations and start with Gesine. Gesine, you have the floor, and if you would also address Andre's question, that would be great.
Of course. Thank you for the questions. Unfortunately, Andre, I can't remember right now a good example of successful counter propaganda, but as a journalist, again, I would be skeptical about every kind of propaganda. So if I will know that this is some information posted by purpose, I will tend to ignore it. And this is something Anton mentioned at the beginning when he talked about tactical and strategic narratives and disinformation. I think I really do agree with him that most of the cases, I would say it's better not to react and to just ignore it, and better to rely on your own stories and on the good media landscape you have in Ukraine. I mean, you have excellent Ukrainian journalists, and I see very often that those stories also get into German media. So I think it's better to be a bit more relaxed and to focus on really those big stories and on positive stories Ukraine can offer by itself. We had a good example a few days ago, if I'm right, by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung about alleged Nazis within the army and so on, and within the defenders movement. It was about Antifa people on the front, and this worked very well. I think, this is my opinion, but I am in my bubble. I'm reading Frankfurter Allgemeine, and if you ask about successful and counterproductive strategies, we must, of course, ask ourselves, what is success and whom can we reach at all? So this is the big question above all, and we didn't talk about this so far. About experts in talk shows, yeah, it's a bit the same. I would like to recommend. So be a bit more relaxed. Yes, I don't like to hear those always the same arguments from the leftists, from Sarah Wagenknecht, but on the other hand, my experience also from my own participation in talk shows is that at the end, among those people watching those shows who are open and willing to listen to arguments, you will reach out with the better arguments. And the fan club of Sarah Wagenknecht won't listen to you, whatever you say. So yes, I think it's good to put a group of participants together also in these shows where you have really competent people who can dismantle the arguments of those disinformation speakers. But it depends very much on the moderation and on whether you give those ones who really know what they are talking about the opportunity also to answer those and to react and to dismantle those false narratives presented by the others.
Thank you very much. And I would like to give the floor to Andrea Senior, and was wondering about, again, how come different countries cite so different sources from Russia?
So first of all, there are a few reasons. The first reason is just very practical one, is that because they use them as the source of the statement of Russian politicians. Very practical reason, but if this is kind of something that has happened in Russia and there was no correspondence from the media directly, then Russian media would have, of course, all of the details, all of the quotes, so they just simply quoting. But then the question is do we really need to quote them? Meaning that we've seen so many quotes. I mean, when it comes to journalism and journalists considered to publish something from the perspective of society value, but we've seen so many publications about just Medvedev random tweets, not really giving any kind of a precise message, or Medvedev can write one day this thing and then in 3 days just completely the opposite thing, but media would continue doing the whole piece of news, about that kind of thing. So that is a large proportion of citation comes from that very practical reason. The second one is that Russian propaganda and disinformation really continue leveraging the freedom of speech, sensitivity. So they keep saying that they are media, that they are journalists, and so on and so far. But most of the media that you even seen on the slide, like RIA Novosti and TASS and other, they are some of them like have very direct flows with Kremlin. Some of the Russian media, like meaning that with the regime that is like public, open source, basically. Some of them, like Zvezda, get the direct funding from the ministry, Russian Ministry of Defense and stuff, but they keep positioning themselves in the eyes of the foreign journalists as the credible source of information, and unfortunately, kind of violating, pressuring that they also like a part of journalistic community and so on and so far. And this is something that I think this is a separate topic that could have a discussion and a lot of recommendations on that side about this raising awareness among the journalism, showing and proving that you cannot quote RIA Novosti, who published, you know, quite famous article, What to Do with Ukraine, with direct callings to genocide and things like that. And some of the top media still have different kind of cooperation with them, like Reuters had cooperation with some of them, like quite long-standing and so on and so forth. And the third is that actually quite often from our even communication with the journalists, they just simply don't really think it's a problem. They don't really see it as a problem. They just like, as Gesina said us in her speech, that there is this striving to have two sides, and they just pick any Russian media for this, to check the box of having the second opinion and the second side, without actually putting into context the fact that this second side is not the opinion that should be included, and is not really a credible source of information. So these are basically the main reasons that we see for that level of citation popping up.
And I think maybe a very quick comment on the distribution of the sources. I think if the question is like on the question of why they are differently distributed, it's often because the digital news, they don't live, they are not isolated from the other parts of the media environment, such as social media and others. And often it comes to do with like the information flow. So information flows all the directions, and it's important to be cautious of that it goes from the media to social media, but it also goes from the social media to the mainstream media. And from country to country, you have different success of different Russian or pro-Russian players, different influences, support, and so on. So that's why you would see this variation from country to country, who is more successful, more of a coming from that historical ties, historical supporters, and social part, which is taking part in shaping that and then leaking to the media.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Ina, about the risks of information fatigue in Germany.
Yes, what's the risk of information fatigue and on this technocratic approach? Well, the biggest risk, it creates the false feeling that everything is under control, that the war is already won by Ukraine, that now we can relax, they have enough, why these Ukrainians always demand for more, and so on and so forth. We can relax, like everything is done and everything is solved, which is very, very dangerous. And you need, again, I think the most mentioned word today, the most often mentioned word is like context. You need to put the data into context. And last month we brought, and this is another very efficient instrument, it's like to have eye-to-eye contact with those who are now in the Ukrainian battlefield. And last month we brought to Ukraine, to the series of meetings with politicians, two Ukrainian tank officers, commanders. And Gesina, as a journalist, interviewed them for German media. And it's very important to get data from them. What I mean, Germany promised to deliver Ukraine 1 battalion of Leopards. Thanks God, this decision, strategic decision was made on providing tanks, which is very necessary. But what is 1 battalion of tanks in the real context? This is 31 tanks, which is enough to cover up to 10 kilometers of a front line. When the front line today in Ukraine is about 900 kilometers. So what does it create? Yes, finally the decision is made, Germany provides Ukrainian tanks. Does it change the real situation when it's in such quantity? No. So it's very, very important to explain what does it mean. And one of the most important dilemmas is how to communicate and to give arguments for Ukrainian victory, that it's necessary, it's now, it's happening, it's possible, with managing expectations when it can happen. Because when you say that, well, they have everything, Ukrainians have everything to make it soon, this is very wrong. And when it not happens in few months, it creates disappointment, and it plays for the Russian arguments like, look, we told you that it's impossible to win over the empire, and Ukraine, like, better leave it to us, don't pay longer for this war. So I really hope that both German and Ukrainian media and politicians will think more strategically on how they communicate, whom they give the floor, and what are the consequences of their daily work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is very convincing. And I now have the task to summarize or to conclude today's meeting. I cannot do it really comprehensively. There are a few points that I noted in today's discussion, also in the first part and the second part, which I believe are important. And it's more like task that we probably have as Germans, and it's a big question mark how much can be done from the outside to help that process. But like Andrea said in the very beginning, that we need a Vergangenheitsbewältigung, so coping with the past. This has reappeared several times in the discussion, that there are some things which are misunderstood about what happened in history during the time of the Soviet Union, but also in 2014, that are still influencing today's view on these issues, and which are feeding into the problems that we have in the German public sphere and the discourse. And the second lesson, or a second thing that was coming up again and again, is the importance of context and of words and terminology, so that we have to be careful. But this, I guess, is clear to everybody here. But we have to ensure that this is happening also in discussions with colleagues about whose words we are using to describe what is happening, and what these words that we are getting used to so much actually convey about, they also have some meaning, like the Ukraine war and Ukraine conflict and so on. So context and terminology also when we cite certain sources. And I will be pay much more attention now to the different also Russian media outlets which are cited in German articles. It's a really interesting field. Then I think an interesting conclusion, maybe not shared by everybody, but one that I have, is that the best antidote to propaganda is not counter-propaganda, but rather helping German society and discourse to mature, to recognize these narratives that come from Russia, and to understand what is happening. So to enable rather than convince, with just something else. So this has been one point that came up one time and another, and finally, that it is important also in Germany to keep the attention on this issue, and that not let Ukraine fatigue take over, because this might be give us a false sense of that everything is going okay, and that we don't have to worry about it anymore, which in the end might turn out to be the opposite. So these were some of the lessons that I took with me from today's event. I found it really interesting, I must say, and I want to thank all the presenters again for the great inputs. And I would like to give now the floor to Andrei for the final conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yanis. Thank you very much to the presenters. Very interesting presentations. We are very grateful to have you with us. My colleague Marco from the UD has left, so it's up to me to inform you what will happen next after this activity. Our project will continue in the next months. We work every day to support strategic communication and counter-propaganda in Ukraine with a lot of activities. We will continue to have direct training on disinformation with Ukrainians, counterpart in Ukraine and in Europe. Regarding this specific video, we will edit it. We will probably cut the technical gaps and make it summarized. Maybe put some cuts between the main questions. And once we have it, and we will share it with our Ukrainian counterparts, the government, and they will use it probably as a training material. So use it on their YouTube or other channels. I will, of course, inform you when this will be ready. And yes, I hope to meet you again in other interesting activities, and very grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a
you.
great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for having me.
Thank you very much. Do pobачення.